So I'm back working on the Intel MDS unit. I showed in the last video that I've completely cleaned this chassis. I've completely dismantled it. I've cleaned all the parts, straightened them out. A few of the metal bits were slightly bent, so I've straightened those. Rebonded part of the moulding. Just one point before I start reassembling this. If you do work on one of these or a similar piece of equipment from this era, one thing that's worth mentioning here is that don't use the plastic surface to rest PCBs on while you're working on them. The reason for that, I'll just quickly demonstrate. This was fairly common at the time, and it's on a lot of pieces of equipment. But if we look at what appears to be just plastic, and I put the test probes on resistance range on the meter on here, you can see it's very low resistance. This is a very good conductive surface. They put a coating on here to act as a shield and a ground, and it goes right across the entire chassis. So wherever I put the two probes, other than the guides for the PCBs, they weren't coated, but the rest of the chassis will give you a very good short circuit on a board if you happen to rest it on here. So just be aware of that. Don't rest boards on here when you're working on them if they're powered up, because it will damage them. Okay, so I've given all the parts a good clean, cleaned the fan, tested this, tested the bearings, they're fine. I've given the back plane a very good clean. I've inspected all the contacts under a microscope to make sure none were deformed. They were all fine. Just had to straighten a couple of pins on this board. But other than that, it's fine. It's ready to go back together. It just have to be assembled in a certain order, otherwise you can't get certain parts on. So firstly, we start by putting the back plane into its final position, making sure it's the right way up, of course. The screws are self-tapping that go into the plastic casing in these positions. The screws at the top have insulated washers to make sure that the board traces aren't shorted out. The ones at the bottom connected electrically to the back plane, and the bracket that holds this in place also connects it electrically to this the shielding. So if you have washed this with liquid, make sure there's no remnants of liquid in the holes, otherwise you can hydraulically split the plastic case. Okay, this bracket fits in this position, but it sits on top of the bracket that locates the power supply, so it needs to be the correct height. The easiest way to do this is the metal thickness is the same as a PCB, a standard 1.6mm PCB. So if you just rest the PCB underneath, it's easier doing it this way than putting the actual bracket in place. If you fit the bracket, which fits like this, then of course you can't get to the screws. So it's easier doing it like this. Put this in place, press it down, tighten the screws, and it should be the right height when you come to fit the actual metal bracket. So when you're fitting the screws at the bottom, there are star washers that fit between the bracket and the back plane. So it is a bit of a fiddle getting this together. It's one of those things that you don't really want to take apart more than you have to. And this again is why I've made a separate test jig for this. I don't want to have to keep doing this. And then it's just a case of working it down into the correct position. Okay, so that's all those screws in and tightened. Next we have the mounting plate for the power supply. So this fits underneath this bracket. And then it's just a matter of fitting the screws to hold that into place. Okay, next up is the fan, and that just drops into this recess at the front. I'll move the chassis back a little bit so you can see that a bit more clearly. So this just fits into this recess. The earthing screw will go onto this hole here. I'll put that on in a few minutes. I want to get it bolted in place first and spin it up to make sure it doesn't foul anything. Okay, so finally we'll attach the ground strap, and that's the chassis assembled. So the cover plate just pops onto the recess at the bottom, but that's it for the initial chassis assembly. I'll be checking to make sure the power supply fits in here and it all lines up. So the next thing we'll look at with the chassis is the actual monitor assembly and the monitor mount, and from that point on what we'll start doing is putting together working chassis, and then we can start looking at the boards and trying to get the thing booted up and running.